Hello everybody, I'm Nick, and yes, testing is fundamentally changing in .NET because version 3 of xUnit was just released, and that brings along many new features, many changes, and ultimately many things you should know about because the vast majority of developers are on xUnit, and if you are on xUnit, you should really be updating to xUnit version 3. Now, the changes are so big that xUnit version 3 is a completely separate package, so you won't really see it as an option to just upgrade to version 3.0. It's separate because it brings so many things along, and you should absolutely know about them. Now, to teach you all of these things, I'm going to bring along my good friend Gui Ferreira to show you everything you need to know and more. Gui makes amazing videos. He has a YouTube channel. Check it out in the description down below. And Gui, take it away.
Thanks, Nick. In fact, there's a huge list of new features coming on xUnit v3. And I can group that list in three main categories. We have new things regarding building extensions for xUnit. We have new things regarding using the CLI. And also, we have new things regarding the experience of writing our own tests with xUnit. And it's about those that we'll focus on this video because there's a huge list, and some of them, I bet that in the past, you missed them. And in the next few days, you will start using them. So let's start going through the list. xUnit v3 brings new templates. If you want to start using them, it's quite simple. Just open your terminal and run the command dotnet new install xUnit v3 templates. Remember that you can ensure that you are using latest versions by using the dotnet new update. Once you have these new templates installed, now you can run the following command to create a project that will have xUnit, so a testing project. So what you will do on that case is that you will run dotnet new xUnit 3. By running this command, it will create a testing project for xUnit. And this new project will have some differences when compared to the previous versions of xUnit. Before we go there, let me just tell you that if you want to build an extension, you now have a template that is the xUnit 3 extension. But you will not focus on extensions in this video, but you know that you have that template there as well. xUnit v3 brings some differences to the project itself. So if you open two different CSproj files of v2 and v3, you will start seeing some differences like the following ones. So on the left, you can see my xUnit v2 project. This is the type of project that you have been creating if you have been using xUnit. And on the right, we can find the version for v3. And now start looking into the differences. The first one is the fact that now the output type is an exe. What does this mean? It means that now I can run my tests as a simple console. I just need to double click and it will run the tests. I can still run the .NET test for that project, but now I have this different type of compilation, the output type of this project, that makes this a regular console application, what is quite cool. Besides that, now we can see this section here that talks about the Microsoft testing platform. We'll talk about that in a moment. What I want you to focus now is on the packages. If you take a look into the package reference, you will see that they have released a new package reference. So now if you want to start using the xUnit v3, you need to install a specific package for that version. Okay, it's not a matter of upgrading this version here. It's a different package itself. So you can see that on the left, the version 2 is xUnit with version 2.9.2. And on the right, I have the xUnit.v3 version 2. If you go to NuGet.org and you look for xUnit v3, you can see there that the stable versions have been published recently. So 3 months ago, we got the 1.0. And also, if we go to the previous version, you can see that they are still doing patches because 2 months ago, there was a new version for v2. One last thing about the new project is that on the project template, you will see that a new file will appear inside of that project. That is this xUnit.runner.json. It is basically a configuration file that you can use to configure the execution of your xUnit tests. The Microsoft testing platform is a new and a lightweight alternative to VS Test. So in the past, all of those testing frameworks that you have been using, like xUnit, NUnit, MES Test, they have been built on top of VS Test. But now things are changing. we have the Microsoft testing platform. New testing frameworks like xUnit are already taking advantage of it, and xUnit is moving on that direction as well. So in this new version, v3, you can enable that experience. For that, you need to bring these two properties that we can see here, and you can even find here a link for the complete explanation on what is the Microsoft testing platform, and now you can use it in the context of xUnit. There's something important that I need to mention. If you are using something like JetBrains Rider, you might need to enable the support for the Microsoft testing platform. Otherwise, the tests that you'll be building here will not be detected. So if you are on Visual Studio and you don't have the testing platform enabled, look for the preview features, and there you will find a new feature that is to use the testing platform server mode. If you are on JetBrains Rider, go to the settings, look for the unit testing settings, go to the VS Test section, and there you will find a flag to enable the testing platform support. There's an important disclaimer before we keep moving on. That is, this Microsoft testing platform is quite fresh. xUnit v3 is quite fresh as well. So your IDE might not support it as well as the previous versions. At least I had a bad experience with JetBrains Rider due to a known bug. So be aware of that, and you might see some things that are not working as expected. And that might not be a problem of xUnit, but your IDE might not support it that well, at least so far. The version 3 brings the test pipeline startup. That is a quite interesting feature to run code that will set up an infrastructure. And this is something that we couldn't do in the past. It's basically executing code right before anything else. So imagine the following. When you run the command .NET test, the test will execute, and by the end you will see the results. But that test execution has several stages. There's one first stage where xUnit will run a test discovery moment, and then we'll start executing the test that it discovered. What if I wanted to run code right before the test discovery phase? That now is possible. Now you have a moment where you can inject code for that startup phase. And also you can run code right before the end of the execution of the .NET test. And you can guarantee that that code will run only once. And how can you do it? You create a class, give it a name, and now you will implement an interface that is the test pipeline startup interface. Once you have that iTest pipeline startup, you need to implement a start async and a stop async. And there you can start implementing the code to bring, for example, infrastructure up and then destroy that infrastructure. And this will run, keep in mind, even before the discovery phase of your tests. But for this to run, you need to register it. You need to say that on this assembly, it will run the test pipeline startup, and this is the name. Now you can start implementing the code that you want. For example, we could bring here a counter with a static counter and we increment it just to ensure that this code only runs once. And that means that on our tests, we can have several tests in different classes, making sure that that static property is 1 on both of them. And if we run those tests, we can see that those two succeeded. So it only executed once. But even more promising than this one is using assembly fixtures. If you have been using xUnit, you are familiar with the concept of a fixture. You have class fixtures and also you have collection fixtures. And fixtures are amazing to set up the preconditions for the tests that you'll be executing. So when you have something like a set of tests that need an infrastructure in place with a given set of data, you need to see that data, for example, you need to bring a test container up. One of the strategies to do that is by having a collection fixture and applying that collection to different test classes. That way, you ensure that you can only run the startup code once and the dispose code once as well for all of those tests, and all of those tests will be running against the same infrastructure. But this brings a problem. While by default, you can run the tests in parallel, by doing this, you can no longer do it. And sometimes there's no need to run these tests in sequence, for example. And now if you have tests from different domains and you need to bring a database up, you will need to run all of those tests in sequence, taking even more time. But that is changing with V3. With V3, now we have assembly fixtures. And an assembly fixture is exactly that. It looks like the previous feature that I showed you, but there's a small difference. While the test pipeline startup executes even before the discovery phase, assembly fixtures execute before the execution. And that brings you the chance to, for example, receive the fixture as an argument for your tests. So for this scenario of bringing a database up, they are amazing. So let me show you. To have them in place, you just need to create a fixture as you usually do on xUnit. Once you have that class, you just need to use the dispose, use the constructor, bring whatever you want here, and write the code to initialize whatever you need. Use the dispose to clean up that thing. Once you have that, you can have your test classes, and your test classes can receive the database fixture, on this example, through the constructor. So you can access, for example, to the connection here. And notice that I don't need to bring here any attribute or implement a given class, inherit from a given class, and I can apply that to different test classes. So that means that all of those tests can now run in parallel. So I don't need to run first this test class, all of those tests, and only after that running for this one. So the fixture will run for the whole assembly. And for that, the only thing that I needed to do is to say here assembly fixture, and the type of that fixture. This is a great selling point for V3. xUnit V3 also brings new assertions. It brings assertions to skip tests, and you can use them in two different ways. There's the dynamic way, that means that the test will be executed and you can do the assert.skip, or you can do the skip when or skip unless. Let me explain. So you can say, always keep this thing. I don't want to have this test. I don't care about the results, for example. This can be part of, for example, of an if statement. If a given condition, just skip this test. Also, I have the skip when, that is, when this condition is true, let's skip and write this reason. Also, I have the skip unless. So unless this thing is true, let's skip it. But there's one way of using this skip that is even more interesting. That is the static approach. So with the static approach, what you do is that instead of defining that inside of the code, you will put that in the attribute of the fact or the theory. So I can say that for this fact, I want to skip because I said so I always skip this test. I can also have the skip when, so I need the skip attribute here to say the message that will be displayed. But now the when is part of my attribute, so it's even before trying to execute that code. And how do I do that? I point to the condition that will say if it's true or false. So in this case, I'm saying that skip when, evaluate this attribute here. So it's running on pipeline. So I look into this property. If it's true, it will skip it. And also I have the unless as well. Same idea. So if now I go to my test runner and I execute my tests, I can see that, for example, the skip test dynamic, this one was skipped. I can also see here for the ones with the attributes, the static ones, which ones were skipped and which one were not. Also, if you look into the test output, you can see the tests that were skipped as well. And for example, if now I go to my terminal and I run the .NET run, because now this thing is a console as well, I can do the .NET run instead of .NET test. I can see here that they were skipped and the reason. There's also another new way to run tests only when you ask for. So if you want to execute a test, only if you specifically say, please run this type of tests, you now have the explicit tests. For that, it's quite simple. Go to the attribute and say that explicit is true. That means that when you do the .NET run, for example, we will have 8 tests being executed, but if we run the tests with .NET run -- explicit on, now we have 9 tests being executed because that one was considered explicit. So we enabled the explicit test for this execution, so it will be executed. During my career, I have seen some teams that have some tests that they only execute them once in a while and they keep them comments, and then it's a nightmare because they don't want it to be executed in the pipeline, for example. Now that everyone needs to comment, someone will forget that and commit that code. This is a great way to do it and quite simple to configure. The next feature is one of my favorites. Why? Let's take a look into this test, and this happens to you already for sure. So this test looks quite simple, and I'm checking if the current culture is an US, okay? If it's from the United States. So I have here this project with version 2 of xUnit, and if I execute this test, it will succeed. But now, let's say that I want to check if the culture is ENGB, for example. If now we run the test, obviously it will fail because my current culture is EN-US. If I want to go around this in version 2, I need to set the current culture. There's many ways to do that. There's many strategies for that. But now in version 3, there's an easy way to do it with just a setting. So now you can do something quite simple. So on version 3, you can either provide a command line switch, or you can simply go to the new xUnit runner.json and set the setting, culture, and the culture that you want to use. Without saving this, if we run the test, we have the error. If we save this, we run the test and it succeeds. So all of that code that you used to need to do to set the current culture using things like the attributes to run code before and setting the culture, you don't need to do it anymore. You can simply go here and set it or provide it as a command switch. The V3 also brings you the possibility to access a test context. That means that inside of your test, now you can do test context.current and take advantage of a set of possibilities here, and I will show you some examples of the things that you can do. The test context has a key value storage that can be used to pass around data. This is mostly targeting extensions, xUnit extensions. So I honestly don't see a value on using it in our day-to-day when you are simply writing tests with xUnit, but now you can take advantage of this, especially on those cases of extensions. Even if you overrun the property, you can read the description, and they are targeting mostly to developers that are building extensions. Another interesting thing that you can do now is that you can access the test context and add a warning to the test. For example, on this one, we can imagine that we would say that we had our assertion, it was successful, but we want to run the tests. And when we run the tests, we can see the warning showing up there. Another possibility is to add an attachment to the test execution. This one is quite interesting. For example, imagine that you are comparing two reports and two CSV files, for example, and you want to keep the data attached to the test execution. You can do that. So you just go to the test context, current, add attachment, provide a name and a value. So if we execute our tests again, now you can see that for the test xUnit v3 context, test context, blah, 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 attachment, we have a file here that if we click, we'll have the data that we are sending to there. The biggest value that I see on this feature is when you are comparing two sets of data that have a lot of data inside, for example, two files. You are comparing, for example, two blocks of HTML, and usually seeing that on the test result window is quite hard to understand the differences. This can be quite useful. And finally, there's one that I believe you will start using it everywhere. That is, When you have an asynchronous test, for example, a test that will call an API, a test that will write to the database, often the code that you are using is expecting a cancellation token, like this one when you run the task.delay, just for the example. So usually what I see people doing is that they either provide here the default, so the default cancellation token that is basically ignoring this, or you need to create here a cancellation token source, provide the cancellation token in case you want to cancel that thing. Now with xUnit v3, you can take advantage of the test context.current cancellation token. That means that if the tests are cancelled, it will trigger the cancellation token and we'll have access to it through here, so you can provide it to the resource that you are using. This is extremely useful for calling APIs, calling databases, any operation with I/O. There's also news on how you provide data to a theory. Let's take a look into an example. On version 2, imagine that you have this type of test that is expecting 3 parameters. So you could define the class data, for example, say the class where the data will come from, and that class will need to implement the IEnumerable of an object array. With that, you could implement the getEnumerator and provide an object array with the different sets of data that you want to run this theory. So it will run first with this set of data and then with this one. The problem with this approach is that you are using an object array, is not typed, and often that leads to problems like, imagine that one of these arguments was supposed to be a string, for example, and I don't have the type safety in place. With version 3, that is changing. In version 3, now we have the idea of theory data. So in the same way that we used to do, we'll have here the class data with the calculator test data. And now, instead of using the object array, I can define a theory data row. To the theory data row, I can now define the different types that are inside of that theory data row. So that means that I can define here that I want to return an int. So if for a mistake I provide here not an int, but for example, a bool, I have type safety, something that I didn't have in the past. So if normally you use class data in your theories, this is extremely useful and it will bring type safety into your tests. So it's all for now. If you like this video, make sure you go to my channel and you subscribe. I would love to see you there. Thanks, Nick. And as always, keep coding.